This idea that like Bitcoin mining is using power the size of Argentina, it is technically true. But what we need to understand is the vast majority of that power would either be wasted or is new demand that's created in geographies where there's excess energy and it can't get to the right place.
Lee, thank you for taking the time to hop on the podcast.
Yeah, William, thanks for having me. I'm excited.
How about we just dive in, have you talk a little bit about your background and what really led you into what you're doing today, particularly at the Texas Blockchain Council?
Sure. So for the last 5 years, I've worked in academia researching blockchain applications in social science, specifically property rights and real estate, actually land registries to be specific. And through that process, really fell in love with the technology, fell down the rabbit hole on crypto and Bitcoin. And about 2 years ago, started to help the community in Texas, first in Dallas and then in Texas at large, to organize themselves politically. You know, I'm a political science professor, so I've got some background there. I wanted to contribute, and the area that I could contribute in is political communications, narrative, studying the narrative, that we make Texas a conducive environment for innovation. We don't want to throw out all regulation. We don't have smart regulation that allows for innovation, and it keeps bad actors at bay. So that's what we do. And the Texas Blockchain Council is an industry association with more than 50 member companies. We successfully researched and helped to shepherd through some pieces of legislation, along with our legislative champions, Representative Tam Parker, Senator Angela Paxton sponsored those bills, and several other legislators were on the bills, including Giovanni Capriglione and Rafael Anchia. So folks from both political parties, which was great to have bipartisan support. And those passed both houses, the House and the Senate. The Texas legislature about a month ago, and the governor signed them about 2 weeks ago. So we're coming off of those successes. House Bill 1576 establishes a working group for the creation of a master plan for how the state should proceed with blockchain technology, how we should invest. And House Bill 4474 makes Texas the second state in the country to put legal definitions around what virtual currencies are, how do you control them, including multi-sig, and how do you perfect a security interest. Pretty much in line with what Wyoming's doing. We support what they're doing. We're fashioning things in a similar way, but definitely a little bit different for the Texas context. We definitely have worked with Wyoming on this stuff. And so now we kind of see Texas and Wyoming in a similar place as far as regulatory climate and friendliness to this innovation. And we hope to continue to partner with them moving forward.
Yeah, this is one of the things that I think is really fascinating when you look at all the moving pieces that are part of it, right? Because you have the companies that are going in, the innovators trying to build organizations. And then from your point of view, you're looking at how are we going to spur that innovation and make sure that we're enablers for that innovation rather than hindering it, for example. Could you talk a little bit through the framework that you guys use in trying to push forward your initiatives and what that entire process looks like?
Yeah, so there's definitely two areas that I could speak to this. One is the public policy side and one is the business development side for our member companies. But to start on the public policy side, we have committees within the TBC that research and basically an amalgamation of subject matter experts on this stuff. We work with the Uniform Law Commission. We work with other states to come up with good policy, and we help research that and work with the legislative staff to actually create the legislation. And obviously they perfect it and send it off to what's called the Legislative Council, which are attorneys that work for the state of Texas that actually put them into the format that you will see when you look up the bill online. That's part of the process. And the other part is just working with other stakeholders. We're sure to work with stakeholders that, may be opposed to the technology or may not understand it yet, and make sure that we educate them and they're able to become comfortable with the technology. And so once that happens and they're not going to oppose us, then we have a cleaner road towards, actually getting things done.
When you're talking about the policies that you're looking to push forward and you're speaking with many of these people who you're their first contact and really diving in depth on the technology, what do those conversations traditionally look like? How do they go? Are they traditionally open-minded? Does it depend on who you're speaking with? What does that entire process look like?
Yeah, I first try to understand where they're coming from, and I can do a lot of background pre-work before the conversation, understand, okay, this guy works for, this association, or he's in this industry, or she's from XYZ industry. that gives you a pretty good idea as to how they're going to think about the technology and allows you to craft your conversation in such a way that they're going to, if they're from the financial services industry, there's a very different way that you would talk about that than if they're from like the medical industry or they're a politician who's not really dealt with technology much. I think one of the arguments that's done really well with some of the elected officials, I shouldn't say politicians, because while they are that, we just we consider them public servants and elected officials. Everybody wants to see the US dollar remain the world reserve currency. And they think that blockchain and crypto specifically is in competition with that idea. But I actually don't think that. I think that if we want the US dollar to remain the world reserve currency, we actually have to be involved in crypto as a country to instill confidence in the US's financial position to our creditors. And let me flesh that out. In order for the US to have low borrowing costs, we have to have high confidence from creditors abroad and within the United States as well in the financial position of the country. If that confidence starts to go away and treasury bills start to become, the borrowing costs start to increase, then our status as the US dollar as the world reserve currency is in jeopardy. So my argument has been, we actually need a Bitcoin strategic reserve and a crypto strategic reserve so that in 5 years, when people look at the United States, it's just like we looked at gold when we were on the gold standard in the 60s. Although it's slightly different because back then the dollar was literally pegged to gold. But now we really just need an asset. It's a diversification of US assets to ensure that when people look at the US, they see financially solvent and sound, and a Bitcoin strategic reserve could assist with that, could be part of that. And how much stronger our position will be in the world if we started a Bitcoin strategic reserve as a country now.
Well, I think that would be a very smart decision on the US side. Speaking of the way that different countries are approaching this, there's been a lot of news coming out about what's happening in China and what they're doing in their approach to mining. Maybe just talk a little bit about what you've been seeing, what the situation is, and then how you think that plays out moving forward.
Yeah, so China's making a monumental mistake, and they are a brilliant regime. And I say brilliant, not that I admire them, but that I respect the speed at which that economy has grown. And they don't make many mistakes, is my point. And the United States and other countries need to be sure to take advantage of it, and we are. A lot of that mining activity is going to come to Texas, and we're welcoming that mining activity here. Contrary to how a lot of people think about it, intermittent demand response loads like data centers that are doing Bitcoin mining are actually adding to grid stability in Texas because they increase the base load, they increase generating capacity, and they turn off when demand is high. So if you think about a floating price for energy that responds to supply and demand, what better for the grid than if we have more demand that's there when power is plentiful, when the sun's shining, the wind's blowing, and the temperature is 70 degrees. But when it's 105 degrees and the wind's not blowing and we don't have a lot of renewables going and the price of energy in Texas is starting to increase, then a lot of these miners find it more economical to turn off. In fact, every single miner in Texas turned off during the winter storm for two reasons. One, because it was the right thing to do to pass power back to the grid. And two, because they had an economic incentive to do so. They have contracts established already that allows them to sell that power back into the grid when the price hits a certain point. And so they actually fed several million homes worth of power back into the grid during the winter storm. And we're not going to see an event like that in Texas anymore. That was unacceptable. I was at an event with Governor Abbott last night, and he said himself, it's unacceptable that happened, and it won't happen again. And we made some pretty easy fixes. Winterization is not easy. That's expensive. But one of the easy fixes is to put natural gas power plants on the list of critical infrastructure that can't be turned off, when like a hospital, when there's a power shortage, because that exacerbated our power shortage when we were turning off things. The state accidentally turned off some power generation plants. They turned power off to those plants, which we just shot ourselves in the foot there. That will not happen again. We're not going to be in a situation like that again. But the long story short is more intermittent load, like loads that can be interrupted, like Bitcoin mining, is healthier for the grid. And if you're ready to jump into this, if you're open to jumping into this, I'd love to talk about how that actually incentivizes the more further development of wind and solar and renewables.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm really happy that you went and touched on this, because I think that a lot of people, when they're just looking at it from a high level and they're not involved in the industry, the narrative can get pushed in a certain way where people aren't understanding the fundamentals of how the grid works or how energy supplied and how mining works. You mentioned something very important where with mining, you have a 24/7 interruptible load. So when you do have those peak demand hours, the miners will shut off and they'll contribute it to the local community. So made a great point there, but yeah, very interested to dive into this aspect, which I think hasn't really been talked about that much publicly, of how mining is driving wind and renewables.
Yeah, the low hanging fruit is flare gas mining, right? This is energy that's being flared off wells that, just for people that aren't familiar with it, this is just natural gas that escapes out of the earth during the mining process. And if it were to be just escape into the atmosphere, as methane, that would be very damaging, significantly more damaging than if it's burned and it leaks out as CO2. I've heard estimates as high as like 30 times more damaging, 30 to 40 times more damaging for this unburned gas to go into the environment. So what they'll do is they'll flare it off in a flare stack, which is just a constantly running flame that's burning this gas. And that, believe it or not, is better for the environment than just having that gas seep into the air without being burned. But what you can do with Bitcoin mining is, a lot of people are doing this all across the state, is they're using that gas and they're putting it into a natural gas genset, and they're creating electricity to power Bitcoin miners. So they're using what would otherwise be wasted gas and wasted energy to mine Bitcoin. That's low hanging fruit. There's hardly anybody that would want to argue against that. I mean, that's very clear that that's a good thing. Some people might say, well, that incentivizes oil companies to produce more oil because they're making profit off this natural gas. I really don't buy that argument, because it's expensive to restart wells and cap wells. I think this is simply just people using creativity and ingenuity to use what would otherwise be wasted energy to produce economic output. And another piece of this that we can talk about wind and solar in just a second, but another piece of this is really important for people to understand is, how much are we willing to pay for an uncensorable monetary system like Bitcoin? I mean, people in Venezuela would be okay if it consumed 10% of their GDP, because that's how badly they need, or people in Argentina or Turkey where there's runaway inflation. They understand the need for this. And we're sort of spoiled here in the US. The US dollar is the world's reserve currency, and we've had stable monetary policy for decades. These other stores of value like gold is a highly extractive industry with very large environmental damage done. And no one says, well, we should not mine gold, or gold's a bad idea. Or think about the printing presses for the US dollar and the trees that are killed to print dollars, literally print them. Or the infrastructure for the traditional banking system has a massive carbon footprint. And nobody's saying that we should get rid of that tomorrow. And I wouldn't be saying that either, because there are some things that bring about so much human flourishing or economic vitality that improves people's quality of life, that we have to be willing to make a trade-off for some minor things to the environment that we're cognizant of, and that we're trying to repair through replanting trees or harnessing wind and solar. But we can't just have everything in our economy at the mercy of renewables. And we want to move that direction as fast as we can, but we're not going to do that at the expense of a stable financial system, or the expense of, telling gold miners that they can't extract any more gold, because there's real economic value that's derived from that, and actual real human standard of living benefits that come up as a result of that. And I think people, if they're honest with themselves, they know that, and they know that there's some things that we have to balance out in this equation.
Yeah, it's crazy how the narrative has evolved over time. People looking at the ESG related to Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining. I mean, in no other industry is the conversation framed in this sort of way. So what do I mean by that? For example, let's take a look at your shirt, for example, my shirt, that mic. We're not looking at the percentage breakdown of power that was used to create those materials, if it was natural gas, coal power. And I think that the way that it's being looked at in Bitcoin mining is just, it's not a way that it's looked at in any other industry. And I think that a lot of times, that you touched on it right there, if you don't understand the inherent value of Bitcoin, then it's very easy to attack. But if you come from the other side where you say, hey, we have an open, decentralized monetary network, the first time in human history where we can attach value to energy in the real world, And not only that, it gives 7 billion people across the world hope at economic self-preservation. It seems like a very, very valuable network that is actually in many ways driving renewables and driving this type of development in society. So I just think that it's important that we're having these types of discussions and putting it out there so we can really show the full picture with an understanding of mining and how the grid and the energy sector work.
Exactly. You got to frame the conversation in the right way. And even once you frame it, once that frame has been established that someone needs to understand the value of this network, there are natural market incentives to develop more wind and solar, because wind and solar is just, and hydro as well, they're just cheaper. The reason why they're not economical in a lot of places, a lot of geographies in the world, is because they're not located near major population centers where there's big power draws. Transmission is expensive. Building more transmission lines, that's expensive. And it's intermittent. People need power 24/7, and wind and solar are not, by definition. Neither one of them, they're intermittent. And so there's some things there that we need to flesh out. Data centers that are mining Bitcoin actually solve both of those problems, right? They're okay to be interrupted. So the intermittent piece, they can go from wind to solar to grid power. They don't care. And they're geography agnostic. In fact, they're more often located in rural areas where there's less grid congestion. This idea that like Bitcoin mining is using power the size of Argentina, it is technically true. But what we need to understand is the vast, vast majority of that power would either be wasted or is new demand that's created in geographies where there's excess energy and it can't get to the right place. We need to get more data on that. I mean, in Texas specifically, we are working to get more data on how much of Bitcoin mining is conducted through renewables. And we, from an anecdotal perspective, are seeing that it's pretty close to half of mining. And I know Elon Musk had that threshold, 50%, and he wanted it to be provable. And, we're working on that, not because Elon Musk is the end all be all. We don't need his approval, but because it's the right thing to do. And we think that it's really great when the economic incentives line up with the right thing to do. Hopefully, that will continue to be the case. Right now in Texas, it definitely is. I'm aware of several projects where there's wind and solar going in, millions and millions, hundreds of millions of dollars of investment in wind and solar that would not be economical without Bitcoin mining. And these are projects that are actionable on the ground. Shovels and construction vehicles are on site building new wind and solar capacity because of the economic model that is enabled by Bitcoin mining. It's a conversation that I feel like if Senator Warren, Elizabeth Warren, were here in this conversation with us and listening to this, that she's a brilliant woman. And I think she might change her tune a little bit, right?
That's the one other piece as well. It's that a lot of the people who are going and let's say are in charge of many large decisions that are directly related to our industry, for example, they're busy taking care of a lot of different things on their own right. They don't necessarily have the time and the energy to go and put the time and effort into learning and diving as deep as we're diving right now in this conversation on all these different industries, because they have so many other pieces that they have to be on top of. And so I think that as more and more people understand the incentives that are driving Bitcoin mining and the incentives that are pushing towards renewables through Bitcoin mining, that the entire conversation is going to really change. And they'll say and see that, hey, in no other industry that at least I'm aware of, do you have 50% of the power generation be from renewable sources? And in Bitcoin mining, you really have that as the foundation and the backbone for an open, decentralized monetary network. Seems like a no-brainer in that case.
Yeah. And I think there's things about this that it's bipartisan, right? If we're looking at the political spectrum of left to right, well, people on the left should be pretty excited about the financial inclusion. Really, all people in the world should be excited about financial inclusion, because our standards of living across the world will get better when the unbanked get banked. Access to credit for people that are actually producing really a lot of value, but are doing it in such a small scale in such a maybe impoverished environment that they don't have that access to credit because it's too expensive for large financial institutions to provide it. And hard money is when we look throughout history, we see countless examples of debasement, whether it's through coinage that's being debased and being supplemented with other kinds of metals, paper money that's being debased, fiat. There's always economic collapse and corruption that follows massive debasements of currency. And that's been true for thousands of years. I don't want to see the US dollar debased. I'm a pragmatist in the Austrian economics world, more like a Hayekian than a von Mises guy. I understand the Fed wants to see a certain inflation target. I understand that. But what we have currently is way outside that target. And I think anything more than 2% should be very alarming. And so that's why I think the United States really needs to wake up. And as a country, we need to think about this. But, my wife and I were talking about this last night. We were coming back from an event and, she was saying our generation and even our parents' generation, the greatest generation, my dad was born in 1949. They have always known the US dollar to be sound. And it's been an incredible tool for economic growth across the world. The Bretton Woods agreements were phenomenal and they're starting to deteriorate. And some people are looking at crypto as an acceleration of that deterioration. I think we need to start looking at it as a tool to prevent that decline.
From a policy standpoint, it's interesting to see all these different countries taking different stances. One of the big pieces of news that was announced when we were in Miami during Bitcoin 2021 was El Salvador adopting it as a currency that can be used similar to the US dollar in their country. And I was listening to a podcast the other day when he was talking through their implementation plan. And it was really interesting to hear his perspective on it and see how it would bring economic prosperity to their country. What are your views on that type of geopolitical move that the president of El Salvador took? And do you think that that has implications in the broader context and scope of what these other countries are now going to be doing in their approach towards Bitcoin?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I'll say right out of the gate, it's brilliant. It's a brilliant move for them for a lot of reasons. And one is because they already have a dollarized economy where they use the US dollar there. So they don't have this, monetary policy instrument that they get to wield. That is wielded by the Fed in the US because they use the US dollar already. So to add Bitcoin as a sovereign currency in El Salvador is brilliant on their part. And to provide $30, the equivalent of $30 worth of Bitcoin to every citizen in the country. Again, brilliant. I mean, just going to increase financial literacy in that country. I don't think it's as big of a deal as people are saying it is because they don't understand, or maybe they do, that it's going to be really hard to convince countries that have control of their monetary policy, which is, 90% of the countries out there have their own currency. There's a lot of dollarized economies out there, Ecuador and Zimbabwe and El Salvador. I wouldn't be surprised if we see all of those countries accept Bitcoin as sovereign currency because it makes perfect sense to them. And they already don't have control of their monetary policy because they use the US dollar. And so to them, it makes perfect sense to do like today. And we'll see those happen soon. It's going to be a while before a country from the Western world or the OECD world or, like Japan or the UK, they have a lot more challenges when thinking about these monetary policy tools and instruments that they are privileged to have. And I would include the US in those OECD countries. So, I think it's significant. I think it's brilliant on El Salvador's part, but I do think that there's got to be a lot more done in OECD countries. When I say OECD countries, G20 countries, whatever, in order to get the policy right for central bank digital currencies and for using Bitcoin as a supplement to monetary policy. I think it's a tool that we should be wielding. And we can't really wield it like we wield monetary policy because it's uncontrollable by any country and any nation state. We need to harness it, though. We need to harness it by having it on the balance sheet so that we can, continue to have the dollar as the world reserve currency, but we can't control it. And I think the sooner that elected officials understand that, hey, we can't control this, but it's happening, let's get on board so that we can enjoy the benefits of it, the sooner that, we'll see global adoption of Bitcoin as a store of value. The jury's still out on transactions, right? Will the Lightning Network be a massive part of payments infrastructure in the world? Maybe. I don't know. Will it be? I think it'll be some part, but there's going to be a lot of different, DeFi and Ethereum is definitely a strong contender to be part of that ecosystem as well. I think there's one thing that's clear though, is Bitcoin as a store of value is completely rational. It fits with generations and decades of established economic thought. And people need to frame the arguments in such a way that it doesn't bring fear into the minds of elected officials and policymakers. It needs to bring that the fear should be not getting involved. The fear should be FOMO, to say, if the U.S. doesn't jump on to this financial revolution and this protocol revolution, that other countries will.
Yeah. And from the mining perspective, how do you think that the industry evolves and looks moving forward following China's decision to go and kick their miners out of the country? How do you think that that's beginning to play out? And what do you think the longer term implications of that are?
Yeah, I think I'd point the listeners to a report that just came out. There's a North American Bitcoin mining report that just came out last week. I'd point them that direction. There's a lot of things that North America has going forward as far as the mining ecosystem. And I'm not telling your audience anything they don't know. I mean, miners are flocking here for a reason. We want to make sure that the policy landscape and the regulatory environment is suitable for that kind of innovation. And we don't want it to be the Wild West. We want it to be light touch regulation, that's smart regulation, that's encouraging people who are acting within the bounds of law and discouraging nefarious actors. I really think the biggest change is going to be two things: hash rate and mining pool, mining pools. I think you're going to see the US, at least North America, including Canada, reach 40% of the hash rate pretty quickly. And I also think that the US and North American mining pools are going to account for a larger percentage of the hash rate than they do today, probably double. And I don't know the exact figures on what the US mining pools like Luxor and are going to see a doubling of the amount of hash rate that they have. And I don't have any, that's just a guess. Obviously, that's anecdotal. It could be, it's just going to be a significant increase. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, I think that when you look at it on a broad scale, the decision that China made is really one of the biggest opportunities for some of these other miners across the world, particularly, I think, in the US and Kazakhstan. You just have all of these Chinese miners who just got absolutely screwed from legislation. And now they're really giving greater weight towards having that regulatory certainty of not having their operation shut down. So having areas that are not only saying and seeming safe and that they're not going to shut you down, but actually incentivizing people to come to your state and mine in your state. I think that that's being given greater weight with these decisions that these miners are looking at.
Yeah, I agree. Even in places like New York, where the legislature, the state body there, contemplated a mining ban. I don't think they actually went through with it, but the legislation was filed. That scared a lot of people away. Because, if you're considering a significant expenditure into non-movable, most of it's non-movable. The mined ASICs actually are obviously mobile, but a lot of the other infrastructure is not. You're going to think twice about that jurisdiction. So we actually have had some companies from New York come to Texas, and these are environmentally conscious miners that are BlockCap is a good example, right? They're mining either with 100% renewables or purchasing carbon offsets for, what they aren't using as renewables, which I don't think that they should feel pressure to purchase those carbon offsets, but I do think it's a healthy thing that we're thinking about that as a community. Again, we got to frame the conversation correctly. Like we talked about earlier in the show, if BlockCap wants to purchase carbon offsets, this is a free market. They're welcome to do that.
Yeah. And obviously you're very involved with Texas and understand what the landscape looks like there. You do have the ear of many miners out there right now who are looking at different places, trying to find the best place to go and put up their operations. What would you say are some of the unique things that stand out about Texas compared to other areas that they might be evaluating?
Yeah. So before I jump into that, I'll say, the Texas Blockchain Council is a nonprofit industry association. So we don't really broker deals, but we make as many introductions as we can because we want we introduce folks that have real estate that want miners there, or folks that have energy power contracts. We work with great companies like Priority Power in Texas that understands the power landscape, and we work with miners. So we just make introductions because we want to see the industry grow. And also, I'd be remiss if I didn't say we are having a conference in Austin on October 8th. Your listeners can find out more about it at texasblockchainsummit.org, where there will be a mining panel, a Bitcoin mining panel, and more conversations about the geopolitical implications of all this as well. So with that said, some things that make Texas great is Texas has some of the cheapest power in the world. I mean, these flare gas miners are literally mining at zero power cost. That's not very scalable. Like, you can't build an industrial scale. Those are having to be mobile units. But for those that are building industrial scale mines, you can get incredibly inexpensive energy, and you can get the energy mix. You can build a solar farm that's on solar in the day. It's on the grid at night when demand is low. You could be in the grid the whole time and just have incredibly inexpensive energy that's not taking away energy from others because it's in a rural area or it's located somewhere where there's not enough transmission to get that power to the population centers anyways. So there's just so many opportunities. And it doesn't hurt that Governor Abbott has tweeted several times that he wants miners to come to Texas. So you've got a lot of regulatory certainty here. And I can't give out exact numbers on any of this stuff because it's not good for a public call like this. But I can tell you that the miners are not disappointed with the power costs that they're finding in Texas. And they're very, we can talk about things that are in the public domain already, like Governor Abbott's tweets and the legislation that's been passed. We can also talk about the Texas Banking Commissioner, Charles Cooper, who came out, his attorneys and his office worked very hard on a statement that provided industry guidance to Texas chartered banks, saying that Texas banks can custody digital assets. So, in a similar manner that, it's not the exact same as the speedy institutions in Wyoming, but provides a similar incentive and framework for the banking industry to be involved in this too. So there's really no better place in the world to be mining Bitcoin than Texas.
Yeah, well, I can certainly say that we've obviously looked at a lot of different places, a lot of different sites, and there are a lot of variables that you have to consider as a miner. I think that you touched on pretty much all the major considerations there: power, regulatory certainty, good mix of renewables, and just having a infrastructure that's being built in the state that really is prime for successful mining. So I think that especially with everything happening right now and the news coming out from China, that you're going to see a lot of miners looking at Texas as a great opportunity. And yeah, definitely anyone who's out there listening, if you're a miner and you're looking to get involved and find out about some great opportunities, I would definitely recommend checking out that event that you mentioned there, Lee.
Yeah, we're excited to have the CEOs of several large miners be speaking on the panel, and those are out there publicly. So I can tell you, we'll have Windstone CEO Chad Harris there, the Rhodium CEO Nathan Nichols. We'll have the CEO of Peter Wall of Argo. I think BlockCap will be there. So some of these recognizable names that are in the industry and they have great reputations will be there.
Taking a step away from mining for a second, I like to ask people what their favorite book is, just because many times you're looking for a new book and you might just not know where you want to spend that time. So I'll send the question off to you. What is your favorite book?
Yeah. So I'll give you two. I'll give you my all-time favorite and then the favorite that I've read in the last 12 months. My all-time favorite is A Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis is a brilliant thinker that lived in obviously the UK in the middle of the century. Just have found a lot of wisdom in that book. Another one, the one that I've liked in the last 12 months is Call Sign Chaos by General Mattis, the former Secretary of Defense. Great book that he's written about leadership and about leading in turbulent times.
What are some pearls of wisdom you glean from that book?
one thing that comes to mind right off the bat is the way that he handled not only pressure on the battlefield, but pressure in a political environment where he was just stoic. He was an unmovable force. He stood with his convictions, and he didn't do it in a way he did it in a winsome way, in a tactful way, so that people, even if they disagreed with him, couldn't help but respect him.
That's one of those things when you look at leaders and try and find those common traits, that seems to be one that you see among the greats. And it's definitely hard to cultivate that. But I think that the people who really crack that code end up doing great things.
Yeah, agreed.
Well, man, Lee, this has been a lot of fun. You're just an absolute wealth of knowledge. And I think that what you're doing right now at the Texas Blockchain Council is great for the industry. So want to say hats off to you and thank you for all the work that you're doing. Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast. This was a lot of fun, and we'll have to do it again sometime soon.
Yeah, sounds good. I'd be happy to.